All right. Now, before we learn about your various options, we need to think about the strategy. We need to think about the goal of what you're trying to do. And that goal is to reduce counterfeiting. That may sound initially obvious, but very often it's lost in the process. So we'll talk about that. First off, you have to accept 0% counterfeiting is impossible. It's not going to happen. It can happen. If you have, um, you remember the Zune? Microsoft's answer to iPods, the Zune. You cannot find a counterfeit Zune because you cannot find a real Zune because nobody wants a Zune. If you want to have 0% counterfeiting, have a failure of a brand. That's the only way to get it. Counterfeiting is the result of success. You create something people want, they want it so much, if they can't get the real thing, they'll buy a fake version. It's not good. You shouldn't allow it. You got to fight it. But it's an inherent part of success in the modern manufacturing structure. And so you need to start right off the bat thinking about your goals. 0% is not your goal. Um, you don't want to just follow metrics either. Very often, especially in large corporations or organizations, there'll be a tendency to focus heavily on what metrics we can move. So if we count all the takedowns, online takedowns, there'll be a lot of pressure to do more online takedowns without any consideration of are these online takedowns leading to less counterfeits? Very often they're not because the takedowns are immediately replaced by the exact same thing, often utilizing AI, so no human actually even ever noticed that you took something down. But it creates a metric, and metrics are seductive. You can show them to your boss, they can show them to the board, and it says we're doing something. But you've got to remember that not everything that can be counted matters. And just because it can be counted doesn't mean it matters more than something that's harder to count. Again, always be thinking, how does this reduce counterfeiting? You need to decide uh, very early whether you have a broader obligation in your anti counterfeiting program. For example, I work with a company that makes glue and tape. When we discover a counterfeiter producing glue and tape, they're never just producing that one type of glue and tape. The counterfeiters don't specialize. They may specialize to the extent by industry, they only produce glue or something because they have a glue factory, but they'll steal from any brand they can. So when we find them, very often they have our competitors' brands. Now, the traditional point of view is that we're all in this fight together. Counterfeiters are the bad guys, and we all have to help each other. They've taken a different point of view. They've said, look, we invested specific money into fighting counterfeits because we felt it will give us a competitive advantage. It will make our brand and our company stronger in the long term. Now, other people in our industry have taken that same amount of money and they've invested in other things. For example, advertising or packaging or the ingredients or dividends to the stockholders or just kept it. And these are all valid choices under economic theory. And the way we find out who made the right decision is capitalism. We let it run out and we see who's in the best position long term. But it would defeat the purpose if then every time their investment in brand protection came across the competitor's brand, they did the work for the competitor for free. They went and enforced the competitor's brand. That would absolutely undermine the whole thing. It'd be the equivalent of you spend that money in advertising, but you don't want your competitors to not be advertised, so you also advertise for them. It's ludicrous, but in brand enforcement, it's very often the assumption that people start with. So you need to think at the very beginning when you're looking at goals, do I have a broader obligation? I would suggest, and it's again not the conventional wisdom, that if you have a non health and safety issue, you have a brand that makes soccer balls, and you find counterfeit soccer balls, you find your soccer balls and somebody else's soccer balls, you do not have an obligation to do their brand enforcement for them. They've made decisions that they hope will economically advantage them. You've made different decisions. This is the reality. However, if you were in a health and safety situation, let's say you produce vaccines or medicine or medical devices, or something that the counterfeit versions are harmful to the public, then I think you do have a broader obligation, both to your consumers in general and to society at large, to take action. That puts you in a more difficult situation. There, I recommend you try and get the industry to come together as a whole and address the problem as a whole. But if you're in a more of a soccer ball glue situation, then by focusing your resources on protecting your brand, you can be in a very advantageous position. But you need to be clear at all times what your goal is and what your goal isn't. Your goal is to reduce counterfeiting. That's the whole point. What it isn't is to make counterfeiting disappear entirely, or to just create metrics that keep people off your back, or to clean up the market for everybody. It's to protect your brand and to stop counterfeits of your product. I don't know about that one. So one of your options for enforcement is a cease and desist letter, also called a C&D. Cease and desist letters are essentially a notice that you put out. It's not by the government. It's by the brand owner, the intellectual property owner, to another party that you believe is violating your rights. And it says, hey, we're putting you on notice. We think what you're doing is violating our rights, and we want you to stop. Now, what does a cease and desist letter include? Very often includes a date, who you are, that the intellectual property that you own, and some evidence to that effect, trademark registration documents or something, or at least a statement that we own this registration number XYZ with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, something that they can follow up on and realize you are the correct person to be making this claim on them. You want to talk about how the rights were violated, in your opinion, and with as many specifics as possible. Often it's helpful to include a photograph of the counterfeit item. You want to identify what laws you feel were violated, although it's not an exhaustive list, and usually is some language that allows you to say, we believe these at least were violated, and there may be others. And then what you're asking for them to do. Usually what you're asking for them to do is stop. That's where the cease and the desist come from. Sometimes you can include an offer of settlement if you believe you have a stronger case, that there have been economic damages, and you wish to present a settlement offer right off the board that says, pay us this amount or undertake these actions, maybe surrender the counterfeit items, identify your source, something along those nature, and we will consider this matter resolved. Your hope is that they will take this cease and desist letter as an acceptable settlement offer and will comply completely. Very often, cease and desist letters have an area at the bottom for signature of the infringing party, where they agree to everything you've laid out in the letter and accept your settlement offer. You want to identify what sort of process they need to go through next, who they would contact, how they would surrender counterfeit items, whatever. You want to give them, in one document, a chance to make things right. Because in your ideal case, in most cases, you would ask for everything you need, so if they agreed, you'd be happy, this would be truly resolved, you could move on. Now, sometimes that includes things like identification of the source of the products, the upline, or where they've sold them, the downline, where the evidence they give or the information they give may or may not turn out to be true. So it could be the beginning of a longer process. They can also reject your offer. They can reject it because they feel the offer is unfair. They can reject it because they don't think they violated your rights, or they don't think you had any rights to violate. So it's not a guaranteed end of the case, but it's a very good step, especially for smaller cases where you feel you have an accurate understanding of how extensive the counterfeiting was in order to get the case wrapped up in a quick, efficient, inexpensive manner. Now, the service of a cease and desist letter can be tricky. The easiest way, especially if you're in a country like the United States, is just to send it by registered mail. you have evidence that they got it. And that's the key issue, is you want some sort of evidence that they received this notice. And in countries that don't have that, or in situations where you're dealing with maybe criminal organizations that don't tend to accept registered mail, hand delivery is important with a person, usually a licensed private investigator, sometimes even police, who can be available to testify later that they delivered the cease and desist letter on this date, this time, at this address to this person. Now, just a personal story. One time I was delivering a cease and desist letter in Chicago. I had a police officer with me. We went down into this basement, this kind of sketchy address, and there was a huge metal door, like a big metal door with one of those slidey, like, Cold War jail, chunk things that you could peek through. And we thought these people are not going to answer the door when we knock on it and some guy in a suit's got a letter. They're going to know something's going on. Plus, there's a police officer right with me. This seems like, and this happens, sometimes counterfeiting is the least criminal of the criminal things your target's doing. So be aware that they have maybe other concerns going on, and you're not a huge threat to them. So we talked for a while. What would we do if we knocked on the door and they didn't answer? Because we're not breaking that door down. And you can leave the cease and desist letter. You could tape it to the door or something, but it's not great evidence that they ever got it. So my plan was this. And if you ever need to use this plan, you go right ahead. You have my permission. I was going to go rent a costume, a duck costume, like a full-body duck costume. And I was going to go to a restaurant, get a plate of waffles. And I was going to come back, knock on the door, and say, "Waffle Duck, your waffles, your home delivery waffles are here." And here was my theory. Nobody, not even the worst criminal in the world, could stand the suspense and the confusion and the desire to know, what in the world is Waffle Duck? Who would send waffles? Why a duck? What do waffles and ducks have to do with each other? The suspense would eat them up. They'd stand there on the other side of the door. Yes, we have a methamphetamine lab and also these counterfeit hats. But what's going on with Waffle Duck? And who sent us waffles? They would have to open the door. Then when they opened the door, I was going to hit them with the cease and desist letter, and I didn't wear the bottom part of the costume so I could run out real quick. They ended up, strangely enough, answering the door on the first knock without me wearing the Waffle Duck costume. So if you ever need to get into a place that looks like they won't answer the door, try Waffle Duck. Now, the question is, why bother with this cease and desist letter? Maybe they'll settle, but maybe they won't. Why not just go ahead and take direct action, file a lawsuit, or go to the police? Well, there are several issues. One, it gives clear notice. Any authority, police, court, anybody, after that point, looking at their actions, if they keep producing or selling counterfeits after the receipt of that letter, will likely assume full intent, full knowledge. And this can be an important factor in terms of damages, in terms of liability. They can make a much lesser claim that we didn't know it was a violation when they got a letter from the people that own the property rights saying it is a violation. It makes later actions more likely to be successful. It can result in a quick settlement if that's what you're after, which can be much more economical. And it can lead to a resolution for at least that part of the issue that can keep you focused, your time and energy focused on more important issues like key manufacturers or key distributors, as opposed, this gives you a cheaper way to deal with lesser criminals.